John Lentz, City and State's Albany Bureau Chief. Joining me today is Jaron Benjamin. He's the Vice President for Community Mobilization and National Advocacy at Housing Works. Just joined the organization as of a few weeks ago.
Right.
Prior to that, you were at the Metropolitan Council on Housing, serving as Executive Director. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And tell me, why did you make this switch? What are you going to be doing in your new role?
Oh boy. So first, it was an extremely difficult decision to leave Met Council on Housing, although I think the organization is definitely headed in the right direction and had some wonderful years there and some experiences that I'll never forget. But when it came down to it, just the opportunity to help lead the charge nationwide to end the HIV and AIDS epidemic that has decimated so many communities and destroyed parts of populations worldwide. I just felt like it was too big of an opportunity to pass up, and I definitely want to be part of this historic event.
Certainly. And just this week was World AIDS Day.
Yeah.
What did your organization do to mark that event?
So along with our allies, Vocal New York, Harlem United, Bailey House, and countless others, Housing Works filled the Apollo Auditorium. We sadly had to turn away some folks after the program started. It was the who's who of the city and state showed up to basically all commit to ending the HIV and AIDS epidemic in New York State by 2020. I mean, New York City is known, along with other places like San Francisco, as being the epicenter of the epidemic in the United States. And the fact that the governor is willing to attach his name to such a bold initiative, I think, speaks volumes to one, where we are as far as political leverage and political will, and two, I think it really shows that we have everything else that we need. All we have to do is to make these investments, and we can end the epidemic even before there's a cure for HIV and AIDS, which I think is astounding.
Right. It was just in the last year, I believe, that Governor Andrew Cuomo came out and said, we will end the AIDS epidemic in New York.
Right.
And what exactly does that mean, ending the AIDS epidemic?
So I think that what it means is we're going to need to stop the rise of new infections, whether it's among some of the targeted populations like black men who have sex with men, or men of color who have sex with men, or the transgender population, or women who are women of color. There's a rising the spread of HIV and AIDS in those communities outpaces the other populations. So whether it's that or just bringing down the number of new infections around the city, we're really looking forward to what the governor is committed to do and what the task force that he's convened is putting in their blueprint. So there are a couple of, I think, really important things. One is expanding benefits that people get in New York City statewide. That seems to be something the task force is taking very seriously. I know there was a lot of waves made by Governor Patterson's veto of the 30% rent cap for people living with HIV and AIDS a few years ago, and then Governor Cuomo's signing of the bill. With Mayor de Blasio's help, I think that we were able, the HIV and AIDS community was able to bring that important issue to light. So I think the next step might be to expand that statewide. Also statewide, we need to make sure that people have access to prophylaxis, to drugs that will prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS. So whether it's, those drugs known as PEP, so there's PEP and PrEP. So whether it's that, whether it's making sure that people who are transgendered or non-gender conforming are included in healthcare and are not further stigmatized from the healthcare system, and are also have access to these drugs that will prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS. Right? I think that there's that combination that will lead to the end of HIV and AIDS and really bending the tide of new infections, so that we've seen through research that if people are linked to care, people are on meds, that their viral load becomes zero and they're undetectable, and it becomes much harder for folks to spread the virus and much harder to contract the virus. And that way we can contain and really end the AIDS epidemic.
Now, going back a second, prior to this, you were the executive director at the Metropolitan Council on Housing.
Yeah.
not the same as the Met Council on Jewish Poverty. Sometimes there's confusion there. But
Lots of confusion there.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally unrelated.
Totally unrelated. Our Met Council on Housing is actually, I think, 16 years older than the Met Council on Jewish Poverty.
I see.
Right.
Okay. Well, housing's a big issue. It's going to be a big issue in 2015.
Yes.
Wanted to get your views on what you think might happen. I know there's some rent laws that are expiring.
Yeah.
And it is sort of the question what's going to happen next.
Yeah, so the rent stabilization and rent control laws, along with SRO and other rent laws, are expiring in 2015 in June. And it's up to the state government to renew those laws. Hopefully they'll strengthen them. I think that some folks in the in the tenant movement were really, were a little. Well, they weren't exactly happy with what happened with the New York State Senate. I think that some of those folks were hoping that it would return to Democratic control.
Right, the Republicans won an outright majority.
Yes, absolutely.
That could pose an obstacle for strengthening these.
Especially when you look at the amount of spending that big real estate has done with New York State Republicans. There's been a lot of spending there. But I think that we need to keep the past in mind and look at what happened back in 2011, where we had the same governor, Governor Cuomo, we had the same speaker, but we also had a mayor, Bloomberg, who was not really a friend to the tenant movement and not really even a big fan of rent laws and rent regulation. We've got definitely what I would call a decidedly pro-tenant mayor, Mayor de Blasio, and so I think that element really can help the tenant movement over the top to strengthen and renewing the rent laws in 2015 by ending deregulation. I think that's the big ticket that everybody's focused on.
Now, we just had a cover story on this. Jarrett Murphy from City Limits wrote a story about this whole issue and the laws expiring. And one thing I took away from it is some people see it maybe as a victory if you can just maintain the status quo.
Yeah, I don't. I would say that most of the folks that I worked with would say the absolute opposite, that would be a failure. Maintaining the status quo means that more and more units are going to become deregulated, and that'll lead to basically no affordable housing in New York City. The more units that leave the stabilization system, the more units that that don't have any protections for tenants that are currently living there. So people will be afraid to report violations, that their landlord might be problems in the buildings they're afraid to report. So I don't see that as a victory. I think that's what that'll mean is more units will continue to leave the system, and that a straight extender or just simply raising the threshold for deregulation won't be a victory at all. I think that really, and rightfully so, most tenants have been talking about repeal of vacancy, just ending deregulation, which I think should be, those are the right talking points.
Okay. And then just one last question I want to ask about Airbnb.
Yeah.
I know that it's a controversial issue. A lot of people are discussing it now. Do you think it's a good thing, it's a bad thing? What are the issues here?
Well, as former spokesman for the Share Better, one of the former spokesmen for the Share Better campaign, I think that I'm definitely going to continue to say what I've always said, which is Airbnb is a corporate entity that is the same. We've seen this before. We've seen illegal hotel operations in New York City before, and they all have the same goal, just basically to undermine our rent laws and to make money. I do understand that there are a number of people that feel like this affords some folks who may need some supplemental income the chance to make that money so that they can make ends meet. But I mean, look at the Attorney General's report that showed that so many of those units were owned by somebody who owned more than one unit, and that they were just using this as a way to make money and do it illegally, and also cut down on the stock of affordable housing that we have here in New York City. And I mean, just speaking in my new capacity at Housing Works, I think that we need every affordable unit online, because we've got clients at Housing Works that are looking for housing, that need housing. We've got so many people living in New York City that can't afford to pay $2,500 a month for rent, whether they're on a subsidy or not. So we can't afford to have those unaffordable units offline.
Jaron Benjamin, congratulations again on your job, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.